Today is Wednesday, April 2nd. It doesn't appear that we may or may not have a quorum, or it doesn't appear that we will. But as colleagues start to join in, we'll announce that as well. If they're able to make it. With that, though, I'd like to go into general public comment. And so if we could ask Becky, Fernando, and David, and Greg to come on up. Morning.
Good morning.
And whoever's ready, feel free to jump on it.
Good morning. My name is Becky Dennison. I work with the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and we work with homeless and very low-income people in downtown and South Los Angeles, the people that would be most impacted by any changes to community care facilities and remain and were originally opposed to the CCFO proposal from last year. And that's why we're very concerned about revisiting this definition issue today, because it's exactly that issue that was the problem last time and would create probably discrimination issues, definitions that people just can't meet, and it doesn't have anything to do with the issues that have been raised, which is absolutely true. Which is a case across housing, types of housing in this city. There are problematic owners, there are sometimes problematic tenants, but we have laws on the books to deal with that. And so revisiting the definitions is not the road we want to go down. We want to actually solve any problems that do exist without creating push-out, without creating definitions that would discriminate against people, and without confining ourselves to approach that has been shown to be both illegal and not effective. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me just address that as well, though. I know under general public comment, it's not necessarily for dialogue, but it's pertinent since this is exactly what we're talking about anyway. Having said that, we've taken the reports and we've started from scratch. And while we've used it for historic purposes and for discussion, we are looking at, and we've launched this committee, and we've said so in virtually every single hearing, and it's been unanimous amongst my colleagues as well, that this is meant to be incredibly inclusive, that we will recognize, no matter what we do, all those elements and all those issues as well. I think there's an agreement that the definitions and whatever definitions we have are antiquated and outdated. So it's not a matter of not updating them or updating them, or using the current enforcement laws we've got on the books, which are also antiquated and don't work. We've heard testimony from experts. We've heard testimony from the city family, from building and safety, as well as planning. And the idea then is to come up with something that makes sense to address all those issues, to be inclusive, to ensure that there will absolutely not be anything discriminatory whatsoever. It'll be much more inclusive. And that's exactly what we're looking at. So I appreciate that. Next speaker, please. Thank you.
Fernando Gaetan with the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. I'm sorry, you called us in order. I just have to say that, the title of this ad hoc committee is the Community Cares Facilities Ordinance, and we're now going well beyond the scope of the original intent of that committee. And I realize that in prior hearings you've discussed the issue of licensed facilities, and it was determined that state law already regulates community care facilities ordinances, and perhaps that what we're getting into now is defining housing and getting into this broader area that's best suited for another committee or another avenue to address, but not here. It seems like this committee is now taking on a lot more than what it had originally intended. The concern that we have, of course, is by looking at definitions, it does get into fair housing issues, no matter how you look at it, because you really have to look at who is being excluded. Once you start to look at definitions and restrict who is defined as a certain category, you run into the trouble of limiting housing options for many folks at a time when the cost of rent in the city of Los Angeles, as a recent study just determined, for someone making minimum wage, they'd have to make 3 times as much just to afford a 2-bedroom home. Limiting options at this point is not the right avenue to take, and certainly looking at definitions that will further restrict housing options for low-income and poor residents of the city is not an avenue to take at this time. I strongly urge the committee to really look at whether or not it's already determined whether community care facilities has been looked at, whether state law can address that issue, and allow housing issues to be determined elsewhere.
Great, thank you. And then again, just to address that issue as well, it is absolutely under this purview to consider everything we've discussed for discussion purposes in terms of housing laws, in terms of fair housing laws, to understand all those definitions, what's on our books, what's on best practices in other municipalities, what's in the court systems, what are best cases cited. Looking at what we've done historically, it is absolutely the core function of this committee, and that's exactly what we're doing, to be much more inclusive, not restrictive, in fact, in those definitions. And I think, having said that again, that's what we'll see come out of this committee. But thank you very much for those comments.
I'm David Reed. I bring the perspective of being next door to an unregulated so-called sober facility. This same company was recently evicted from a house in West Hollywood because of the size of the city. They were able to do that, and because they were not operating within the purviews. We're still trying to find out exactly why they were evicted, but they were, because they brought the whole household worth of furniture over next door to us. The city attorney had a closed meeting with the management of the house next to us. We were not allowed to attend, but in that meeting it was found out that a 5-bedroom house has been converted to a 10-bedroom house. There remains to be 4 bathrooms in that. It would be that 4.5 adults are sharing each bathroom in that house. You can imagine the situation this brings. That's why at 12:30 last night, 12:38 exactly by my digital clock, the discussion and ruckus next door was enough to wake me out of a sound sleep. This is a nightly occurrence. A week ago, I was taken to the hospital with what they thought was a stroke. It turned out to be a TIA. The doctor said, "What is stressing you out in your life?" And this went off on a long discussion with that. These houses are money mills. Talk about the cost of housing. $1,200 a bed, $2,400 a bedroom next to us, $24,000 a month for this house, with no regulation, no medical support. It's the same old story, and it needs to be addressed. Citizens can file a complaint with the Justice Department if these homes are in violation with the American with Disabilities Act. But if the city were to say, we need the Justice Department to rule whether these homes must comply with the ADA, it'd carry a lot more weight than the little voices out here in Washington. And these homes are not compliant with ADA. The bathrooms aren't big enough. There's no access to the second floor. These are money mills, and there needs to be some regulation by the city and the state.
Great, thank you very much. And since I've commented on the others as well, just with that, and I think it's drawing that fine line that we see, that we don't want to discriminate at all. We want to be more inclusive. And in fact, and I've shared my story up front with everybody at the beginning of this hearing when we launched the ad hoc. And this comes from a personal place as well. I've had those personal experiences with my sister as she was disabled, and in illegal homes that we didn't even know weren't licensed or didn't provide services at the time. There is, it's not even a fine line. It's pretty cut and dry and clear in some of these that are exactly that, just the money mills that aren't providing homes or reputable organizations. And looking at how do we define those with ensuring we protect the housing issues, the shortage of housing, the rents that people can't afford, making sure that we just simply don't label it the way that the first reports were doing that. And I think we certainly are all in agreement with that. But with that, appreciate you coming out again and speaking. Thank you. And if there are any other public comment cards, any others from the public that wish to speak, if you can turn those into the clerk as well.
Greg Spiegel, Inner City Law Center. This now is the 7th meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee, and we are about to hear from the Planning Department on its proposed recommendations for family and boarding house definitions. This is right back to where we ended on January 30th, 2013, when this same definitional approach was rejected by City Council. Again, councilmen will Englander summarily dismisses important fair housing law, this time the Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision about the Newport Beach Ordinance. Again, we hear only from Councilmember Englander's chosen experts from planning, city attorney, and building and safety. Again, the problems complained of, overcrowding, illegal construction, slum conditions, illegal resident behavior, are all problems that are illegal under current law. Again, there is no evidence that these problems are unique to the relationships of the residents or unique to shared housing or indeed any other kind of housing. Yet here we are, back again, on the precipice of hearing recommended definitions that categorize housing as if these problems were unique to the relationships of the people who live in the housing. This is the same rejected approach. Nothing has changed. It would still be illegal and it would still do nothing to solve the problems. The city already has existing legal authority to deal with these problems as an enforcement issue. Although members of this committee have asked to look at nuisance and code enforcement, Councilmember Englander has dismissed enforcement without study. All we have heard is that the Department of Building and Safety struggles to conduct inspections without a search warrant. This is absurd. Every day, other city and county agencies, including the city's housing department, conduct routine housing inspections in hundreds of units without search warrants. In contrast, Building and Safety has habitually and historically under-resourced and underachieved in its code enforcement efforts, so much so that in 1998 the City Council took multifamily code enforcement away and gave it to the Housing Department. All that remains in Building and Safety's code enforcement portfolio is single-family rentals. Given Building and Safety's historically bad record at code enforcement, it is no wonder that there are unresolved problems in single-family rentals. Inner City Law Center is dealing with one right now, today, at 5700 South Hoover in Councilmember Price's district. The building is commercial, yet the unscrupulous owner rented out tiny, uninhabitable office boxes to vulnerable tenants as so-called supportive housing. For 2 years, Building and Safety has dragged its enforcement feet.
Right.
I just have like...
If you want to submit it that for the record, you can do that as well.
And
so with that, I want to address,
Thank you.
again, some of the comments that were made on that to say, just for the record, just to correct the record, the experts that we brought in weren't hand-picked experts from outside. These were the city family. These are the folks from general managers to our city attorneys to code enforcement, the folks who are actually on boots on the ground, the ones that have had the experience for well over a decade with this issue, struggling with the antiquated problems that we have, and again, being more inclusive. We've also had the ability to bring in public comment at each and every single meeting, which I believe some of you have testified at each and every single meeting, and we'll continue to do that. We've had that ability, and it's been a very open process and dialogue. It's by no means, again, where we started off on in what I will call the last round. These are there's been questions and input from all of my colleagues and what they'd like to see back as we begin that process, and we'll continue with an open process as we move forward and have a final report from this committee that will then go to the City Council for full approval. So again, I appreciate your continued support of participation and look forward to your comments in the future on this as well. Our final speaker, thank you all very much, Maria Fisk. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Kern Price. Councilman, good morning. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, members of the committee. I'd like to present to you a perspective from residents, neighbors that live this. We've had 3 illegal boarding houses filled with crimes, murders, arson, untoward events, not only to the residents who live inside these facilities, but the surrounding community. Other cities across the state have managed to make some type of ordinances, boarding home issues that can be regulated, something within the code that this city has yet failed to do. Every day that goes by that the city fails to act, more people within these homes will be abused, there will be more crime, there will be more neighbors that suffer. We have been intimidated, not only by those in the opposition, but by those very homes and operators that operate right next door. I am asking this committee to do a fact-finding mission to talk to other cities across the state, see what they have done, talk to city attorneys that have been successful. Rather than using nuisance abatement, discrimination, our hands are tied. We can't do anything. I'm asking you as a city to do your diligence to protect the safety. This is not about some pretty home, some nice color. This is about murders, abuse within the community, abuse to people who stand forward. And I'm asking for once and for all, the city takes the responsibility. Please do something to have an effective ordinance. Nuisance abatement is a backdoor approach. This is not discriminatory. You untie your hands. Please have the will to do something. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for participating and showing up as well. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's comments and everyone showing up this morning for this. With that, I'd like to ask if we can, Planning Department to come on up. As well as, if we could, Building and Safety. Good morning. Just for the record, so we can put it on the record, since the statements were made earlier, were any of you handpicked by me as the chair to take on this issue, or were you selected by the departments that you represent for your expertise and your experience? Just so we can get it on the record. Did any of you ever get any phone calls or direct meetings from me saying I would want to handpick you as my experts? Or were you simply assigned by the department for your experience and knowledge?
Kim Arthur with Building Safety Code Enforcement, Chief Inspector. My department picked me to be here and work on this.
Great, thank you very much.
My name is Hector Buitrago. I'm with Building and Safety. I'm actually a retired employee, but back on a contract. And again, my department asked me to help in this matter.
No.
Alan Bell, Deputy Director of the Planning Department. The Director of Planning asked me to work on this issue. And as I had stated in prior hearings, this is an issue that actually I have been working on since 1997.
Yeah. So all have long careers and expertise in this field, and wanted to make sure for the record that the heads were nodding yes. But
thank you for that clarification.
Yes,
Chairman.
yes. Just want to make sure we get that on the record since that suggestion was made. Okay, with that, I think where we're at now, let me just open it up to my colleague if he wants to jump in. What we're looking at is, first and foremost, Councilmember Bonin's question about the percentage of nuisance properties that are shared housing situations. Wanted to make sure that we did all cast a wide net in terms of looking at statistics or reports that may or may not have been captured in what kinds of response numbers have we had with LAPD or DBS. I understand that from the conversations and looking further into this to try to extrapolate some of the data that Mr. Bonin was looking for, which was, in these nuisance properties, how many are we really talking about in terms of calls for service? And in looking at, from my experience, calls for service, I think we need to define what that means. Those egregious cases, the ones that have chronic issues, LAPD does not have, and I've checked with them, they don't comp stat out statistically and account for if it's a nuisance property. They just roll out if there's a call. Certainly they can talk about chronic locations, but it could be a domestic issue at a home that has a chronic issue. It could be a number of things. The children of that property, that resident's having issues. I mean, it could be just all kinds of issues. So their disposition of the call is based on many, many different things, but they don't catalog it as a nuisance property. Building and Safety doesn't either, from my understanding. Nuisance properties could mean many things, but they tag it as if it's mostly a physical structural issues, things of that nature. So there's nowhere to pull out, sort of nuisance, either licensed or unlicensed, boarding homes or facilities. They're not tagged as facilities in that way. But then in talking about and looking at other departments to try to answer Mr. Bonin's questions and looking for the reports, and I want to try to figure out a way to get there eventually in the long term. But in the short term, we also have county probation, county sheriff that responds for mutual aid purposes and other reasons. We also have Los Angeles Fire Department. We also have the health department in some cases that I've heard of. We have, so there are a number of different city agencies, county agencies, even state agencies, Children and Family Services. So there's all types of different regulatory agencies that respond to different types of properties for different types of reasons. And so there's no way to just capture that and say, here's a report of how many calls or how many types of nuisance properties. We'd like to try to figure out a way to do that. But if any of you can shed some light on that as well, and if there's been any effort or any success in trying to locate some of those numbers.
You know, we, like you stated, we do not categorize these kinds of complaints. You know, we would have to say that it's probably not a very large proportion of our workload. There is a handful of these facilities that kind of become a big issue, but it's only a handful of them. In proportion, I would probably say is maybe about 1% of our number of complaints that we get on these kinds of facilities, and a lot of them we cannot find substantiation to the complaint. And a lot of them we write up because they have illegal additions or some other illegal work that we can write orders on.
So let me ask you this on that. When you say it's a handful, maybe it's 1% of the total caseload, that's within your department for your particular issues. Does that include, are you referring to all those departments with the same type of numbers, or strictly speaking for your department?
Yeah, this is strictly building and safety.
Okay. Because I've heard from, obviously we've heard from other departments as well that their numbers are much higher than building and safety. By the time it reaches building and safety, and the difficulties you guys have in enforcing antiquated issues, which has been under the testimony thus far, the other issues are the chronic calls out from LAPD, LA Fire, County Probation, Family Services, all the others that are having a much larger percentage of call-outs and chronic callers and issues. So just wanted to make sure that
the numbers could be higher, and unfortunately, we cannot find any way to reliably get even an approximate number. So the numbers could be higher, but our perception is that it's not a large percentage of our total workload.
Within your department?
Within building and safety, correct.
Right, okay. And Alan, if you want to shed any light on that as well, I know you've had the opportunity over the years to deal with this and meet with other departments. Any idea?
Well, I would second Mr. Buitrago's comment in terms of the planning department. We do have an administrative nuisance abatement function within the department, and that the purpose of that particular unit is to address uses that have become a nuisance, but these are uses that are actually legally permitted by the zoning code, but because of their operation, they have become a nuisance. So we have, for example, typically there might be a recycling center, there might be liquor stores that are legally permitted, but because of their operation, they have become a nuisance, and then we will hold a hearing, we will attach additional conditions on their operation. Typically, we do not receive within our office, the Office of Zoning Administration, residential uses that have become or identified as being a nuisance property. And then within the zoning code itself, there is a two-track process, a separate process for dealing with nuisances where there are existing tenants or existing residents. That was adopted by council a few years back when we were looking at strengthening the city's nuisance abatement ordinance. But the amendments that were made a few years ago acknowledged the fact that we had existing tenants and we needed to have a separate process. So there's a procedure that would allow, for example, if we wanted to terminate a residential use, we'd have to appoint a court receiver, for example. So that's what's in the code today. I do not believe that that provision has actually ever been used since it was adopted. Again, almost all of our nuisance abatement activities are focused on commercial uses, not residential uses.
Yeah, and then as they've explained to us from both DBS and City Attorney's Office, is difficulties on the residential uses because of those antiquated issues. So no, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think what we're going to look for now for the next meeting, and for the next scheduled meeting in 2 weeks, we'll be on recess, and then we're going into budget. So this will give us some time for planning to put together a report that I'd like to come back to this committee after that for discussion, and we can hear from the public. And we would request that we have input, and we'll go ahead and ask folks to turn out the experts' public testimony. And when I say experts, the housing advocates as well as the residents. I consider everybody that's got an interest in this an expert, because they've all dealt with it from all sides, to weigh in on the report and use it as a launching off point for discussions and moving something out of this committee. With that, we'll ask for, based on not the previous recommendations, not the previous report, but the dialogue that has occurred in this ad hoc committee, the input from my colleagues on the panel, as well as the input from the public and during public comment, and all the fact-finding and best practices that we've looked at in other municipalities, notwithstanding the fact that there's been public comment a lot for and a lot against some of those issues, but looking at something to be more inclusive in terms of, and ensuring that we're protecting fair housing laws, we are protecting the disabled community, we are protecting all of those concerns that were brought up. We'd like to have new recommendations for discussion on definitions for the following categories: family, and what planning department would look at updating our regulations for that, and ensuring that we protect a family as well as what that would mean and define it. Single housekeeping unit, a boarding or rooming house, a dwelling unit, and add to that a community residence. And that's critically important in talking about where we discussed the idea of self-selection and the definition of single housekeeping unit. By adding a community residence, then we would ensure the possibility that we can discuss those opportunities to protect fair housing issues. Those are where some other cities have fallen short. And in the report, we'd also like to see options for if they fall into one of those categories, if you will, and they're outside of the state purview, then, and when I say outside of the state purview, they don't have the ability to obtain a license. They're either 6 or more, or they're more than 6, 7 or more, or they don't offer one of the services for state licensing. What would the ability for the city? What options would we have to permit them and allow them in an efficient, easy, streamlined fashion? It's been the discussion that my colleagues and the spirit and the feeling of this committee to look at opportunities to ensure that we can streamline it, we can make it efficient, and look at, particularly as they relate to single-family zones, and then to also address the issue is how would this fall into anything but single-family zones. So I believe from what I've heard from my colleagues as well is we'd like to see sort of a by right scenario for anything outside a single-family zone as well. And so those that would fall into a single-family zone, how would that work? and add to that any possible public benefit allowance for those to even cast a wider net and to be more inclusive. And I believe that's where what we've heard from folks in the past, the city was going in a direction of being less inclusive. So we're trying to open that up to be even more inclusive. Any other recommendations? I think we've captured most of it, but anything else you think would be pertinent to those discussions? A report back, I believe, would be a good launching off point to start moving forward and having a final report from this committee that we can start spending the next several meetings honing in on. Anything that my colleague would like to add to
Mr.
that?
Chairman, just being said, I think that was a good outline that you provided, and I would just include any hybrid. There may be some combination of two that
Yes.
are worthy of some kind of discussion. But no, I think we were having a very thoughtful, reasonable discussion on it. I appreciate the efforts to make it very inclusive and to include all stakeholders. And so I look forward to that continued level of input as we, refine any policy changes that we may want to make.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Any questions, thoughts, comments?
No, I think that gives us appropriate direction, and we'll come back with a recommendation report, and we'll work with Building and Safety.
I would ask that you work with City Attorney's Office as well, as some of the legal issues and challenges have been brought up. We want to make sure that we comply with all of those issues as well.
Absolutely. We are joined at the hip with the City Attorney. So.
Terrific. Excellent. Great. I believe that concludes the meeting then, and thank you all again for coming out this morning. We are adjourned.